Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Alexei closed the door behind him, the echo of the click reverberating through the dimly lit hallway. The house was eerily quiet, yet inside the tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Irina was already in the living room, sipping a glass of red wine, her usual facade of nonchalance plastered on her face. She smiled when she saw him, though something in her eyes hinted at unease. It had been a long night, the costume party, the laughter, the music, but there was something off. Something about the way she kept disappearing, whispering in hushed tones with Brian. Alexei had noticed. And now sitting across from her, his laptop glowing faintly on the table, he felt the cold rage simmering just beneath the surface. "I noticed you had quite the night," he began, his voice calm, almost too calm. He watched as she raised an eyebrow, taking another sip of her wine. "What do you mean, darling?" she asked, her tone playful, but there was an edge to it, a crack in the mask. Without a word, Alexei flipped open the laptop. The video started playing instantly, the quiet shuffle of movement barely audible in the room. Irina's face paled as she watched herself on the screen laughing, stumbling into the pantry with Brian, their hands all over each other, kissing, undressing. It was all there, recorded in unforgiving clarity. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Alexei asked, his voice low but icy, his eyes never leaving her. Irina opened her mouth, a flood of excuses rushing to the surface, but nothing came out. The truth was right in front of her, undeniable. This was only the beginning. He had planned everything. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Irina's hands trembled as she placed her wine glass down on the table, the clink of glass against wood a stark contrast to the damning images playing on the laptop. Her eyes darted to the screen, then back to Alexei, searching for something, anything that might offer a way out. But there was none. The video continued to roll, unflinching in its betrayal. Alexei leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face devoid of emotion. It was as if he was simply observing, detached from the scene, but inside, his mind was spinning. Every second that passed on the video was a punch to the gut. Each sound, every touch between her and Brian was another betrayal ripping through him. "Alexei, please," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not what you think." He didn't flinch. His eyes bore into hers, hard and cold. "Oh," his tone was calm, mocking even. "So what exactly am I seeing here, Irina? Enlighten me." She stammered, reaching for words that would not come. "It was a mistake. I was drunk, confused. I thought it was you. We were all wearing costumes and it was dark in the pantry." "You thought it was me?" Alexei's voice cut through her desperate plea, sharp and precise. He clicked a button, turning up the volume on the video. The sounds of their laughter, the obscene intimacy between her and Brian, filled the room, and with it, the words she had whispered in Brian's ear that still echoed in his mind. "God, you're so much better than him." Alexei's jaw tightened as the phrase replayed, venom lacing every syllable. He had heard it that night from the hidden camera he had set up after months of growing suspicions, knowing something wasn't right. Now the damning confirmation was laid bare for both of them to see. Irina's face crumpled. She looked like she wanted to disappear, her entire body trembling now. "Alexei, please," she begged, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean any of it. I was just saying things in the moment. I didn't want to hurt you. It didn't want to hurt me." His voice was deadly quiet. "You didn't think I would find out. That's what this is, isn't it? You thought you could keep this secret, keep me in the dark while you and Brian." His voice broke for a second before the rage returned stronger than before. "Did you honestly believe I wouldn't notice? You made me into a fool." "I love you, Alexei," she sobbed, falling to her knees in front of him. "It was a mistake. I'll do anything to make it right. Please, I'll end it with him. We can move past this." He stared down at her, a cold, calculating look in his eyes. "You think this is something we can move past?" He closed the laptop with a sharp snap and stood up, towering over her. "This video is just the beginning, Irina. I'm going to make sure that you and Brian pay for this. Both of you." And with that, Alexei turned, leaving her sobbing on the floor as he walked away, already planning his next move. Alexei left the room, his footsteps echoing in the dimly lit hallway. Each step seemed louder than the last, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. But it wasn't sadness he felt, no, not anymore. His grief had long since turned into something darker, something sharper. Rage coiled tightly inside him like a snake ready to strike. He could hear Irina sobbing behind him, her desperate pleas muffled through the walls. But he didn't stop. He didn't turn back. He had made his decision the moment he saw the video. This wasn't just some drunken mistake, as she claimed it was betrayal, calculated and cruel, and Alexei was done being the fool. He entered his office, shutting the door behind him. The soft click of the latch felt final, like the closing of a chapter. He stood there for a moment, staring blankly at the bookshelves that lined the walls before walking over to his desk. The room was neat, meticulously organized, much like the life he had built with Irina. Every book, every piece of paper had its place, but all that order meant nothing now. His marriage had been chaos masquerading as stability, and he hadn't even noticed it crumbling beneath his feet. Sitting down at his desk, Alexei opened his laptop again, the screen flickering to life. The video file still sat there, paused on the last frame of Irina and Brian engulfing each other's arms, oblivious to the world around them. His finger hovered over the keyboard, and for a moment, he considered deleting it, erasing it from existence, but he quickly pushed that thought aside. No, this video was his weapon now. As the gears of his mind turned, cold and methodical, Alexei's rage simmered. He couldn't let this go unpunished. They had taken something from him, his trust, his pride, and he would make sure they paid for it. Both of them. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from Brian, of all people. Alexei's lip curled into a sneer as he opened it. Brian, great seeing you tonight, man. Irina said she had a blast. Let's grab a drink this week. The audacity. Brian had the nerve to message him, pretending everything was fine, pretending that they weren't both aware of what had happened in the pantry. Alexei's fingers twitched over the phone screen, itching to send a response, but he stopped himself. No, this wasn't the time for a confrontation, not yet. He had to be smarter than that. Instead, he let the message sit unanswered. There would be a time for Brian, but it wasn't now. First, he had to deal with Irina. His mind raced through the possibilities. Divorce was the obvious option. He had the evidence, after all. The video would make sure that she got nothing, that he could walk away with everything. But the thought of simply ending it, of letting her slip away, felt too easy, too clean. No, Alexei wanted her to suffer, to feel the weight of her actions. He wanted her to watch her life fall apart piece by piece, just as she had done to him. A dark smile crept across his face as an idea began to form. Divorce could wait. For now, he would let her believe she still had a chance to fix things, to salvage their life together. He would watch her squirm, desperate to undo the damage she had caused, while he pulled the strings from the shadows. With renewed determination, Alexei stood up from his desk and headed back to the living room, where Irina still sat on the floor, her face streaked with tears. She looked up as he entered, hope flickering in her eyes, though her lips trembled. Alexei, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. I'll never see him again, I swear. But he stared down at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he let the silence hang between them, letting her drown in it. Then, with deliberate slowness, he spoke. Do you honestly think this is something we can fix? His voice was calm, too calm. It sent a shiver down her spine. After everything you've done? I made a mistake, she pleaded, crawling towards him on her knees. It meant nothing. You have to believe me. I love you, Alexei. Love? He almost laughed, but the sound was bitter. If this is your idea of love, then you're even more delusional than I thought. I'll do whatever it takes, she cried. I'll beg, I'll apologize to you every day for the rest of my life if I have to. Just please don't leave me. Alexei watched her grovel, and for a moment he almost felt pity. Almost. But then he remembered the video, the smug look on Brian's face, the sound of Irina's voice as she degraded him to her lover, and the pity vanished. I'm not leaving, he said finally, his voice cool and detached. Not yet, anyway. Irina blinked, confused. You're not? No, he leaned down, his face inches from hers, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. But things are going to change around here. Irina, you think you've suffered so far? You haven't seen anything yet. Her eyes widened in terror, and for the first time she understood. This wasn't going to be a simple apology and forgiveness. This was punishment, and it was only just beginning. Satisfied, Alexei straightened up and turned on his heel, leaving her kneeling on the floor, shattered and broken. This was just the start, and he was going to make sure both her and Brian regretted ever thinking they could betray him. The next morning, Alexei woke early, the sun barely rising over the horizon. The events of the previous night still clung to him, but the heaviness in his chest had transformed into something colder, sharper. His mind was clear, focused on what had to be done. Irina lay in bed beside him, her back to him, her breath shallow and uneven. Even in sleep, there was no peace for her anymore. She was probably still reeling from his words, the icy promise of revenge he had whispered into the darkness before walking away. He slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and headed to the kitchen. The house was still, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock. For a moment, Alexei just stood there, leaning against the counter, staring at the shadows that danced across the floor as the sun began to creep through the windows. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had unraveled, how a life he had spent years building could come crashing down in a matter of moments. But that's how betrayal worked, wasn't it? Silent, sudden, and devastating. So cold, calculated thought settled in his mind as he sipped his coffee. He wasn't done with Irina. No, last night was just the beginning. He was going to tear apart everything she held dear, piece by piece, and he would do it with the same calm indifference she had shown him. It wouldn't be a dramatic explosion of rage. No, it would be slow, methodical, and deliberate. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. Another message from Brian. Brian, hey man, you okay? Haven't heard back from you? Want to grab that drink this week? The sheer nerve of it made Alexei's blood boil. Brian had no idea that his secret was out, no idea that Alexei had seen everything. For a moment, Alexei's fingers twitched over the keyboard, tempted to send a vicious reply, to tell Brian exactly what he thought of him. But no, that would be too easy, too predictable. Instead, Alexei pocketed his phone and walked outside. The cool morning air hit his face, a welcome contrast to the smothering heat of his anger. He needed to stay calm, stay focused. If he lost his temper now, he'd lose control of the situation, and that wasn't an option. He had a plan forming. The wheels had already begun turning last night, and now, as he stood in the stillness of the morning, it solidified in his mind. First, he needed to set the groundwork. Irina had no idea what he was planning, and that was his greatest weapon. She was already on edge, terrified of what he might do, and he could use that fear to his advantage. Returning inside, Alexei sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of his coffee cup still steaming. He opened his laptop again, the screen glowing faintly in the dim room. The video of Irina and Brian in the pantry flashed on the screen for a second before he closed the file and moved on to more pressing matters. Step 1 was ensuring that Irina wouldn't have a leg to stand on when this was all over. The video would play a crucial role, of course, but there was more to it than just catching her in the act. He needed financial leverage, something that would guarantee he could walk away from this marriage with everything, leaving her with nothing. Irina, for all her faults, had never been interested in their finances. She left everything to Alexei, trusting him to handle their accounts, their investments. It was her mistake, and it would be her undoing. He logged into their joint accounts, scanning the numbers with cold precision. Everything was in place. Over the next few weeks, he would begin shifting money out, moving it to accounts only he had access to. Quietly, subtly, so that by the time Irina noticed, it would be too late. She wouldn't see a single cent from him once this was over. And as for Brian, well, Alexei had a plan for him, too. By the time Irina woke up and shuffled into the kitchen, still bleary-eyed from a night of restless sleep, Alexei was already sitting at the table, his laptop closed, his face unreadable. She looked at him hesitantly, like a child testing the waters, unsure of what mood he might be in. "Morning," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexei looked up at her, his expression blank. "Morning." The awkward silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Irina fidgeted, unsure of what to do, her eyes darting between Alexei and the coffee machine, as if desperate for some kind of distraction. "About last night," she began, her voice trembling. "We don't need to talk about it." Alexei cut her off, his voice calm but firm. "Not now." She blinked, clearly taken aback by his response. I just want to apologize again. I know I hurt you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Alexei stared at her for a moment, his face betraying nothing. "We'll see," he said simply, his tone giving nothing away. Irina stood there, unsure of how to respond, before nodding slowly and turning to make herself a cup of coffee. Alexei watched her move around the kitchen, the woman who had once been the center of his world now reduced to a stranger. So a stranger who had betrayed him, who had taken everything he had built and thrown it away. He wasn't finished with her, not by a long shot. This was only the beginning. So the days passed, the tension in the house grew heavier, thickening the air between Alexei and Irina. It was an unspoken standoff, both of them circling each other in a fragile truce. But beneath the surface, Alexei's plan was already in motion, and Irina, though she might have sensed something brewing, had no idea just how deeply her world was about to unravel. Alexei played the part of the composed husband, going about his daily routines with an eerie calmness that unnerved Irina. He still kissed her goodbye in the mornings before work, still asked her mundane questions about dinner or their shared calendar, but there was no warmth behind his words, no connection, just the cold indifference of a man calculating his revenge. In the evenings, after they had shared the usual hollow conversations over dinner, Alexei would retreat to his office. He spent hours there, poring over bank statements and legal documents, making small strategic moves that would ensure Irina was left with nothing when the time came. He had started transferring funds, moving assets into private accounts, away from their joint holdings. Bit by bit, he was preparing for the inevitable. Irina, on the other hand, was living in a constant state of anxiety. The guilt gnawed at her, but it was the fear that kept her awake at night. Every time she looked at Alexei, his expression cold and unreadable, she felt a wave of panic. He hadn't lashed out, hadn't confronted her again since that night with the video, but his silence was far more terrifying. It was like waiting for a bomb to explode, not knowing when or how it would happen. One evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She found Alexei in his office, the glow from his laptop casting sharp shadows across his face. He barely glanced up when she entered the room, too engrossed in his work to care. "Alexei," she said quietly, her voice trembling. He didn't respond at first, his fingers still typing away at the keyboard. But after a few moments, he stopped, his hands hovering over the keys before slowly turning his gaze to her. "What is it, Irina?" His tone was calm, detached. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I can't keep living like this. I know I've hurt you, and I know things are broken between us, but I need to know what's going on. Are we just going to pretend like everything's fine? Are we going to fix this, or is this it?" Alexei studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Do you think this can be fixed?" he asked, his voice flat. Irina bit her lip, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to try. I want to make things right, Alexei." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Make things right. Irina, there's no fixing this. You made your choice the moment you let Brian into that pantry." Tears welled up in her eyes, but Alexei remained unmoved. "I was stupid," she whispered. "It didn't mean anything. I know that's hard to believe, but it's the truth. I love you, Alexei. I don't want to lose you." "You already have," he said coldly, his words cutting through her like a knife. "You just don't realize it yet." Irina's breath hitched as the tears spilled down her cheeks. "Please, Alexei, don't say that. I'll do anything, whatever it takes. We can go to therapy, we can." "Therapy?" Alexei interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think sitting in a room with a stranger, talking about your betrayal is going to change anything? No, Irina, I don't need a therapist to tell me what I already know." He stood up, looming over her, his eyes dark and filled with a fury that was no longer hidden. "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what I need to do." For a moment, Irina thought he might hit her. The intensity of his rage was palpable, like a storm brewing just behind his eyes. But instead, he stepped back, his expression hardening once more into that cold, controlled mask. "I'm not going to scream at you," he said, his voice eerily calm again. "I'm not going to break things or yell. But understand this, Irina, you've destroyed us. There's no going back. And when I'm done, you'll regret ever thinking you could get away with this." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The terror was back, a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. She had thought that the worst was over when he hadn't exploded in anger the night he showed her the video. But now she realized that this quiet, methodical rage was far more dangerous. "What are you going to do?" she finally managed to choke out. Alexei smiled, but there was no warmth in it, no kindness. "You'll find out soon enough," he said softly, before turning away from her and heading for the door. "I'm going out," he added, his voice casual, as if nothing had just transpired. "Where are you going?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "To see Brian," he replied coolly, glancing back at her. "We have some things to discuss." With that, he walked out, leaving Irina standing alone in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She collapsed into the chair he had just vacated, her mind racing with fear. What was Alexei planning? What would he do to Brian? And more importantly, what would he do to her? As the door clicked shut behind him, one thing was clear: the game had only just begun. And Alexei was in complete control. Alexei walked out of the house with the same eerie calmness that had unnerved Irina for days. His steps were measured, deliberate, as if each one carried him closer to the inevitable confrontation with Brian. The crisp evening air hit his face as he headed toward his car, but it did little to cool the fire burning inside him. The rage that simmered beneath the surface was controlled, but it was there boiling, waiting to be unleashed. The drive to Brian's place was quiet, the streets nearly empty. Alexei's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles wet against the leather. He had thought long and hard about how to handle this, about the best way to make both Irina and Brian feel the full weight of their betrayal. He wasn't a man prone to rash decisions, no. Everything had to be meticulously planned. Every move, every word, carefully calculated for maximum impact. Brian's apartment was in the city, a sleek, modern building that spoke to his arrogance and vanity. As Alexei pulled up, he could feel his heart rate quicken. He wasn't nervous, far from it. But the anticipation was electric. Tonight was about taking control, about making sure Brian knew exactly who he was dealing with. He parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, staring up at the building. The lights in Brian's apartment were on, a faint glow visible through the blinds. Alexei could picture him there, sitting on his expensive leather couch, maybe sipping a glass of whiskey, completely unaware of the storm that was about to descend on him. The thought brought a cold smile to Alexei's lips. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and headed toward the entrance. The doorman barely glanced at him as he walked past. He knew Brian well enough from their various get-togethers, and Alexei had been a frequent guest in the past. Tonight was no different, at least not on the surface. As Alexei rode the elevator up to Brian's floor, he felt the tension building inside him. The doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped out into the hallway, the plush carpet muffling his footsteps as he made his way to Brian's door. He didn't bother knocking. Instead, he raised his hand and rapped sharply against the wood, his fist echoing in the quiet corridor. It took a few moments, but eventually the door swung open, and there stood Brian, dressed casually in a fitted shirt and jeans, his ever-present smug grin plastered on his face. "Alexei." Brian greeted him with feigned enthusiasm. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here, man. What's up? Everything all right?" Alexei's expression remained neutral, unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Brian's grin faltered slightly, but he stepped aside, motioning for Alexei to come in. "Sure, come on in. Want a drink? I was just about to pour myself one." Alexei stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room. It was just as he remembered, tastefully decorated, modern art on the walls, expensive furniture. But everything about Brian screamed money and self-indulgence. It was fitting, really, for a man who had problem indulging himself with someone else's wife. "I'm fine," Alexei replied curtly, declining the offer for a drink. Brian shrugged and walked over to the bar, pouring himself a glass of bourbon. "All right, suit yourself. So what's on your mind?" Alexei watched him carefully, studying every movement, every expression. Brian was so confident, so sure of himself. He had no idea what was coming. "It's about Irina," Alexei began, his tone steady but with an undercurrent of menace. Brian froze for a split second before recovering, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Irina? What about her? Everything okay between you two?" Alexei stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I know, Brian." The room seemed to grow colder in an instant. Brian's smile wavered, and for the first time a flicker of panic crossed his face. "Know what exactly?" he asked, trying to maintain his casual demeanor, but Alexei could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his grip tightened around the glass. "I know about the pantry. I know about the party. I know everything," Alexei said, his voice calm but filled with icy fury. Brian's face went pale, and the glass in his hand shook slightly as he set it down on the bar. "Look, Alexei, man, I don't know what you think." "Stop." Alexei's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this didn't happen. I saw the video." Brian's mouth opened, then closed, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. But there was none. All right, he finally stammered, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Yes, it happened, but it wasn't what you think. It was just a stupid mistake, okay? We were drunk, it didn't mean anything." "It didn't mean anything," Alex repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them until he was standing inches from Brian. "You had sex with my wife. You humiliated me, and you think you can just brush it off as a mistake?" Brian swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. "I'm sorry, okay? I'm really, really sorry. I never meant to hurt you. It was just a moment of weakness." Alexei's lips curled into a bitter smile. "A moment of weakness? You're gonna need a better excuse than that." He could see the fear in Brian's eyes now, the realization that there was no easy way out of this. I'll stay away from her. I'll never speak to her again. Just please, Alexei, let's not make this into something bigger than it needs to be." Alexei stared at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, watching Brian squirm. Then, with a calm that sent a chill down Brian's spine, he spoke. "Oh, it's already bigger than you think, Brian, and I'm just getting started." Brian's eyes widened, his breath quickening as he realized the full weight of Alexei's words. This wasn't going to end well for him. Brian's panic was now fully evident. His usual swagger, that casual arrogance that had always grated on Alexei, had completely vanished. In its place was a man desperately trying to stay afloat, scrambling for any lifeline in the storm he now found himself in. "Alexei, man, please," Brian pleaded, taking a step back, hands raised defensively. "I don't want any trouble. I'll do whatever you want. Just let's figure this out, okay? We've been friends for years." "Friends?" Alexei's voice dripped with disdain. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them again. "Is that what you call this?" "Friends don't screw each other's wives, Brian." Brian swallowed hard, his back now nearly against the wall. He was cornered, and he knew it. It wasn't like that. It wasn't serious. It was just, I don't even know what it was. A mistake, a stupid mistake. Alexei's expression didn't change. His cold, calculated rage was all that filled the room. Brian's words fell flat, meaningless in the face of the betrayal. Alexei had played these scenarios in his mind over and over. Would Brian grovel? Would he try to act tough? In the end, it didn't matter. Nothing Brian could say would change the outcome that Alexei had already set in motion. "Let me ask you something, Brian," Alexei said, his voice low, steady. "When you were in that pantry with my wife, what were you thinking? Were you thinking about your friendship with me? Were you thinking about the consequences?" Brian stammered, struggling to find the right words, but Alexei cut him off. "No, you weren't thinking about any of that," he continued, stepping even closer. "You were thinking about yourself, about how good it felt to have something that wasn't yours, about how you could take whatever you wanted without a second thought." So Brian's face was pale, his breath shallow and quick. "It wasn't like that," he muttered, almost to himself. "It wasn't." Alexei let the silence hang between them for a long moment. Then, in one swift motion, he slammed his hand down on the table beside Brian, making him jump. "You're going to pay for this," Alexei said, his voice calm, almost casual, but laced with deadly intent. "You and Irina both." Brian's eyes widened in horror. What do you mean? Pay how?" A cold smile crept across Alexei's face. "Oh, don't worry, you'll find out." But for now, he leaned in close, his face inches from Brian's. "So you stay the hell away from her, from me, from anything that even remotely touches my life. Because if you don't, Brian, I will destroy you. I'll make sure you lose everything. Do you understand me?" Brian nodded frantically, his hands shaking. Yes, I understand. I'll stay away. I promise. I swear." Good," Alexei said softly, stepping back. "Now get out of my sight." Brian didn't hesitate. He nearly tripped over his own feet as he scrambled for the door, desperate to escape the nightmare he had walked into. So the door slammed shut behind him. Alexei stood there, his mind calm, sharp. This was only the beginning. After Brian had fled, the door slamming behind him, Alexei stood in the now quiet apartment, the tension still hanging heavy in the air. He hadn't lost control, not even for a moment. He had wanted to watch Brian squirm, to see the fear rise in his eyes. And now he had gotten exactly that. It felt good, but it wasn't enough. No, this was just the first piece of a much larger game he was playing, and Brian was just one of the pawns. Alexei sat down on the leather couch, his thoughts shifting back to Irina. Her sobbing apologies, her pleas for forgiveness, they meant nothing to him. Not anymore. He could still picture her on her knees the night he had shown her the video, begging him to understand, promising that she would make things right. But there was no making this right, not after what she had done. He had been careful, though. He hadn't revealed too much. Let her think he was considering her apologies, that maybe there was a sliver of hope. It was all part of his plan, a slow, methodical unraveling. She would suffer in silence, just as he had. She would live in the constant fear of not knowing when the hammer would fall. That was how he wanted it, keeping her on edge, watching her crack under the pressure. Alexei checked his phone, scrolling through the messages he had received over the past few days. Several of Irina's friends had texted him, trying to check in, asking if everything was okay. No doubt she had confided in some of them about the tension between them, though he was certain she hadn't told them the full story. Irina had always been good at pretending things were fine, at wearing a mask even when everything was falling apart. He smirked, considering how quickly that mask would slip once the next part of his plan fell into place. The divorce would be the final blow, but he was in no rush. Alexei had already set things in motion, transferring assets, redirecting funds, and making sure every financial chance was in his favor. Irina had no idea that her life was slowly being drained away. By the time she realized it, there would be nothing left for her to hold onto. No money, no security, and no future. But there was more to be done. He wanted her to feel the full weight of what she had done. She needed to experience the loss, the betrayal, the humiliation, just like he had. Alexei opened his laptop and began typing an email. It was time to reach out to Irina's employer, a well-respected law firm where she worked as an associate. So they had always been strict about the image of their employees, especially when it came to personal conduct. A little well-placed information about her indiscretions with Brian, especially considering Brian was also a client of the firm, would surely raise some eyebrows. Maybe it wouldn't cost her the job immediately, but it would certainly damage her reputation. It would be the first crack in the foundation of the life she had so carefully built. As he hit send, Alexei felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. He wasn't just going to leave Irina. He was going to dismantle her life, piece by piece, until she had nothing left. So the email had been sent, a quiet blow delivered to Irina's career that would take time to unravel. Alexei closed the laptop with a soft click and sat back, staring at the ceiling. It was strange how detached he felt now, as if the man he'd been before, the one who had been devastated by Irina's betrayal, had faded away. What remained was someone colder, sharper, and more calculating. He had thought that confronting Brian would give him a sense of closure, but now he realized it had only fanned the flames of his revenge. Irina was still asleep when he returned home later that night. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her silhouette rise and fall with each breath. She had no idea how far things had already spiraled out of her control. He hadn't said a word about his confrontation with Brian, and as far as she knew, the fragile peace between them still held. But Alexei knew better. There was no peace. There was only a carefully constructed facade, and soon that too would crumble. He wasn't just going to leave her. He was going to destroy the life they had built together, leave it in ruins, just like she had done to his trust. The next morning, Alexei played his role as if nothing had changed. He made coffee, kissed Irina on the cheek, and even made light conversation about the day ahead. She seemed tense, watching him closely as if expecting something to erupt at any moment. But Alexei remained calm, his mask firmly in place. This was how he wanted it. He needed her to think she still had time, that she could fix things, that maybe they could move forward. It was essential for what was coming next. After breakfast, he told her he had some errands to run. Irina nodded absently, still lost in her own thoughts. She was so consumed by her guilt, by the uncertainty of where their marriage stood, that she didn't notice the cold precision in his actions. Alexei didn't go far. He drove to the local bank where he had been making his financial moves over the past week. Inside, he met with the bank manager to finalize the transfer of the remaining joint assets into his personal account. The divorce papers had been drawn up, with everything skewed in his favor. Irina wouldn't know what hit her until it was too late. When he returned home later that day, Irina was waiting for him in the living room. She stood when he entered, wringing her hands nervously. "Alexei," she began, her voice shaky, "I've been thinking maybe we should talk. About everything. About us." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Talk." "Yes," she swallowed hard, her eyes filling with desperate hope. "I want to make things right. I know I've hurt you, but we can fix this. I know we can." Alexei took a step closer, his gaze steady. "No, Irina, we can't." Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, Alexei." He cut her off, his voice cold and final. "It's over, Irina." She stared at him, stunned into silence. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he continued, his words slicing through the air like a knife. "The divorce papers are ready. You'll be served soon." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at him as if trying to understand what was happening. But the truth was staring her in the face now, undeniable and brutal. "So I'm taking everything," Alexei said, his voice low but firm. "The house, the accounts, everything. And when I'm done, you'll have nothing left." Irina collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. She had finally realized what he had known all along: there was no coming back from this. Alexei stood there for a moment, watching her crumble. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. Just a cold, quiet emptiness. He turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Irina alone in the ruins of what had once been their life together. It was over. End.